Okay, and with that, I think we're ready to go. So I want to just thank Leslie so much for taking the time out of her schedule during what is becoming the busy part of the semester that's getting started to help us understand how we can be successful in applying for these grants and how to think through them, what they are, how to understand them. And so I will be keeping an eye on the chat, so feel free to put questions in there. And then we'll have some time for conversation as we go. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Leslie.
Oh, and they're now just testing the weather sirens. You're maybe doing that outside Sense Motor. Sorry, my headphones are at home on my desk, so I make sure to bring them in today. Thank you, everybody who's came here today for the webinar, and those who we managed to schedule during your classes and your other commitments who are watching it later. I appreciate you giving us the time. I'm here to talk a little bit about the summer faculty funding and the regular research grants that the Committee on Research give out. And I think it's useful for me to begin, as the siren comes closer, and explain why I'm here and make clear that I'm really just speaking for myself. I was the College of Arts and Sciences Humanities rep on the Committee on Research from 2018 through 2021. So I've been involved in this review process 3 times. I was also vice chair of the committee, so I kind of have some insights on how it works. I also, just for all of you here, our colleagues who serve on core, I mean, not only are they the coolest kids on campus, we really owe them and other people who serve on these major committees a lot of thanks. The Committee on Research is one of the standing committees of the University Academic Senate. It does really important work in terms of advising on research policies here at Marquette, giving advice to Jean Hassenlop, but then also handing out funding and awards through the Way Klinglers, the Haggerty Awards for research. So it's really a good group. If you ever have an opportunity to serve on it, on the Committee on Teaching, these are really rewarding experiences. So I want to kind of recommend them. And you've seen the names here. I know a bunch of you are serving on some of these committees. And so you may not be on the ones that are as cool as the Committee on Research, but you know, that's good. Okay, sorry. Let me start off. And in terms of the summer faculty funding and regular research grants, these are the first grants that come out at the beginning of the year, due generally at the end of September. They get a lot of applications across fields in the university. The number of applications are pretty much all fundable to some extent. And one thing I hope you'll all take away, not only about these awards, but Way Klinglers and the others, there generally are more worthy applications, more nominations than the committee actually has funding available to give or awards ready to give. What that means is the process of discernment is very important. The Committee on Research is reading very closely, looking for ways to distinguish applications. And we certainly want to spread the money to as many folks as possible. So those are sort of factors as they're coming in. The years I was on the committee, we typically had requests for about twice as much funding as we had available budget. And that's even including last year where the pandemic kept the numbers a little lower. So in terms of how I'm going to present my remarks, and again, please, if you've got any questions, throw them in the chat or things you want me to expand upon. I think it'll be useful to first say something about the process, about how review works, about how the audience, when you're thinking about how you address these proposals. And while the things that I'll be focusing on are specific to the SFF and RRG, they obviously have lots to do with grantsmanship generally. And so I know, again, seeing your names, I know a bunch of you have quite a bit of experience with that, so you'll recognize several of my points. I'll sort of wrap up my remarks, and I don't plan to go more than a half hour here, I've got sort of 4 takeaways, ways to succeed at the application process. So the first and most important point is to remember that you're not really writing for people in your field. You're writing for your colleagues across fields who come at research in different ways. So it's an educated audience, but they may not do their work the same way you do yours. That's going to be one of the themes I stress here. For the humanities folks in the audience, the Humanities Committee consists of the College of Arts and Sciences representative, a representative from communications, and one from education. Typically, humanities is one of the smaller submission groups. The bench sciences, the STEM fields, they always tend to have a ton, as do the social sciences. And I think that partly reflects the fact that those are fields that are often more dependent on external funding agencies to do their research. And there's a fair number of humanities scholars where, you know, we can sit down and do our work with printed materials or perhaps oral interviews. We don't have as much of a robust tradition of grantsmanship, but that's one of the key goals of this university funding. It's to get all of us applying for more external grants. Now, the process we've adopted over the past 2 years, I'm no longer part of this, that they adopt is somewhat similar to the NIH review panels. We have expanded, and typically what happens is folks who have had an SFF or an RRG in a previous year are invited to join the review panel. It's partly to spread the work around again, because those other committees have so many applications, but it's also sort of a process of education to get more people involved in the process and understand how funding works. We want there to be some transparency to the system that is going on. Now, as you're preparing this, so you're submitting a grant, it's probably going to people who are not specifically in your field. It's very important to follow the directions, and that includes TypeScript. Do not handwrite your cover sheet. And I know that that seems like a kind of pedantic complaint. What it suggests to review committees is that you're kind of cutting corners and doing things last minute. And that's going to raise questions about whether your scholarship is the same way. It's also so much easier to read. Those of you who are involved in graduate admissions, perhaps going through those applications, you know how much harder it is to read things on a screen than it is when you have paper files and you're sort of going through things. So when we open up a file, I mean, we're using the Teams, the SharePoint, you know, you click it open, then you've got to increase the size of it if you've got kind of middle-aged eyes or you're sick of reading on screens. And so that's already taking time. So you want it to be typewritten so it can be read really clearly. This comes into the formatting as well. So having things single space, leaving space between paragraphs, you don't need to indent. You're trying to make it as easy as possible for the reviewers. In terms of this process, how it works, so the committees, we divide up the reviews so that every application has at least 3 sets of eyes on it who read it carefully. The first reader is the one who will be responsible for presenting your application to the committee. That's where the abstracts become very important so that we can say, this is what Drew Kim is working on, this is what he's looking for money for, and this is why it matters. We need to be able to pull that very easily out of his application because we're going to be presenting it. There'll be a secondary reader who will add some comments as well as a third, but there may be a person on the committee who has only read the abstract, but we're trying to get a broad group there and put them into dialogue with each other. In addition to the content, which I'll focus more on in just a second in terms of the review process, I would say that there is a prejudice towards junior faculty in this process. And these are people who maybe have not had external funding previously, and these grants are designed to make it possible for you to go out and apply for other funds. Junior faculty are on the tenure line. They may be coming up as tenure, and we want to help them get there. So when we're considering how resources go, there's a bias toward that. Folks who have had grants before then, that's neither necessarily a positive or a negative. You certainly will see people applying for these multiple times. If you have previously had a grant or even just previously applied, the committee certainly will be looking at what sort of external grant applications you have put in. And it's not so much about results. I mean, the committee understands that somewhere like the NEH has a fund rate of about 7%. So how many people are realistically going to be getting one in a given term? But they want to know you're going out and trying to get things and getting things that are appropriate for you. If you put in a grant and you are not funded, or even if you are, you will get a brief bit of feedback from the committee. You also are welcome to discuss it with Jean or with ORSP representatives who are not voting members on the committee, but they sort of help keep track of things and administer the process. And these are people who can also give you good feedback on the grants, as well as make suggestions for agencies you might consider for grants. I think those were things about process. Let me just sort of pause, because I've been talking at you for 10 minutes and it's always sort of awkward in a Zoom. Does anybody have anything about process questions they wanted to ask before I go to the 4 big points? Okay. Well, my 4 ways then to craft successful SFF and RRG applications. So the first one is understanding the difference between these 2 grants. Summer faculty funding is about buying time. The regular research grant is about things or experiences. And my first really big point is the regular research grant, you should privilege it over summer faculty funding in most cases. So obviously you've got to apply for the right grant for the project. I'm not challenging that point, but the summer faculty funding grant, that is a fixed amount. That's $5,500. If you apply for it and you're awarded it, that's what you get. We can't give somebody a half grant. With the regular research grant though, we could fund up to the full amount, $6,000, we could give partial grants. And my opening point was the committee wants to give you money. They want to give you money to do your research, to get to your place, to have some of this support. So the flexibility that is in the regular research grant is very important. In the humanities pool, I saw a lot of applications that would come in for summer faculty funding, and they would talk about how I'm going to use this to travel, to go to this library or do something like that. And it always made me sad because, again, limited pool of money, but we maybe could have funded part of a travel, a budget, a plane ticket and other things if they had applied for a regular research grant. Examples of things you can budget. A budget is a part of this grant. So it's travel, it's flights, it's lodging. It could be student support. People fund research assistants, graduate students, undergraduates. It can fund course buyouts. It can fund supplies, perhaps books, digital copies, software, hardware, recording equipment. We've seen people who have done interviews, who have gotten transcription services. At this time, the university does not allow you to fund childcare or elder care through a regular research grant. That's a university policy. But because of the NSF advanced discussions that are going on, there's some faculty who are really pushing the university to reconsider that. And the Institute for Women's Leadership is really taking some leadership. So there could be a point where those things would come in. And Anya is asking, can we apply to both at the same time? Yes. And I strongly encourage you to do both, if that makes sense for you. Now, there's certainly going to be some people who can't come up with anything to spend money on. And that's okay. If you're just applying then for the SFF, the summer faculty stipend, whereas the research grant buys stuff, the SSF, which I can never say, it is buying your time. And the way to think of that is, what are you doing in the summer that is different from the work you would normally do as a Marquette faculty member? So you'd probably be doing some editing, you'd probably be preparing for classes, etc. It's got to be something extra. And that can be really hard to do. I absolutely grant that. And that's kind of our challenge. I mean, for my field, so I'm a medieval historian, other historians. I see Patrick's name up on the screen, my fellow colleague here. Patrick or I might say, well, I need to sit down this summer and write a chapter for my next book. That's not really extra. That's what we do. And if we didn't have this stipend, that's what we'd be doing anyways. It's not as competitive against those who are making a case for something else. What are examples of that something else? It could be participation in a workshop where you're maybe getting special training, like if interviewing techniques, maybe that's not something that you had done previously in your graduate training, and there's a workshop. Maybe there's a digital humanities sort of project that you want to launch, and there's something being run by the NEH that you could go to. The thing that is easiest, I will admit, and I say this again as a medievalist who has had these grants to go to Italy, to my archives, travel, work that you can't do in Milwaukee. I need to be in Piacenza to read this manuscript, which is handwritten, and I could not get digital copies of it, something like that. Tara Daly, who has recently had one of these grants and who joined us in the review, she needed to be in, now I've just spaced where her work is, Bolivia. She needed to be there to be working on the physical space that she was looking at, how the architecture and the landscape relate together. Some people though, again, to the RIG, you might be able to purchase someone to work as a research proxy for you. If you are saying things like, the summer faculty funding will buy out time that otherwise I would need to teach, be specific. I would need to teach SOCH 1001 in the first 6-week session. And so this funding would allow me to not teach that course. And during that time period, I would do this article that would then be published. So that is relating kind of to two other points. Let me just pause here. I think that's Jordana asking a question about participating faculty getting money. Participating faculty are not eligible for summer faculty funding or regular research grants. Those are funds that are limited to tenure line faculty. You do not have to be tenured. To assistants are fine. There are the research awards that are now coming through the Committee on Research that have sort of an honorarium connected with them. And then the task force that Gary Meyer and I think Pat Loftus are leading, the participating faculty task force. They have allocated more money to support participating faculty research. But to the best of my knowledge, that will not be going through the Committee on Research. But that's certainly, I think, a good question to ask of Gary about those funds. All right. So if reason number one was thinking about ways to privilege the regular research grant, number two is about showing how the summer faculty funding is buying your time. My third point is to not behave like a typical faculty member. We always assume that everybody does research just the same way that I do research, the conventions of my field. We all do that, and we are really often not conscious of that. So I don't really mean that I'm assuming that you all do archival research, that you need to go and see documents that only exist in this particular collection, or that you're going to then write a book about it. But that's what people do in my field, and I have never been in one of these review sessions where our colleagues in comm and education who write articles express surprise at how many people say, oh, I'm writing a book. This is something that I think carries through to other applications you might make at Marquette, like if you're applying for a Way Klingler. You know, if a book is normal for your field, you kind of want to explain that. You want to explain how research works in your area. Are articles what are typical? That's great. Explain that. Explain the significance of journals. Explain conventions in terms of authorship. I cannot believe how many times this becomes kind of a stumbling block. I'm in a field where people tend not to co-author things. And in fact, even co-authorship is assumed to kind of be less. There are not as many collaborative projects. That's something that's changing. And that's completely different in so many fields. But the thing is, you all, your fields, they have different conventions about who's like the lead author. I mean, you all know this. I mean, there's some forms of the health sciences where the lead author is the one who's last in the list of names, and there's others where it's first. I mean, these are all the sorts of things that you need to explain that you may not realize. And this is one where having somebody who is outside your field, who maybe doesn't really do research in your area, can be super helpful. So explaining the conventions. This sort of ties in, and you know, I'm telling you all this stuff that you have to explain, but you also know that this is really a pretty short application. And that's one thing where, you know, working early and being able to explain why it's significant. And this is always really hard. My fourth point is going to be realistic, and the ways we're kind of tying these things together. So you've got a committee of folks from all around campus, and there are particular themes that are going to be really obvious that we can all understand. So if we think about inequality, if we think about trauma, if you think about health-related topics, I mean, all sorts of things are pretty easy to hang on to. The committee does not really have, though, a bias towards applied research versus pure research, if I'm thinking like really in math terms, but you have to explain why things matter. So if I want funding for my late 15th century project, I need to explain how it matters to my field. I've got to be thinking about keywords so that people have a way of understanding what the work is I'm doing. They're not just thinking, there Leslie's off in Tuscany again drinking wine. I've got to convince them of why my project matters here. But I said it's got to be realistic. You know, I can't say this study of this friar is going to help us understand religion in the modern world. I mean, the committee is really looking to understand. So in terms of the claims you make, the budget and the time, what is going on during the funded period, that all needs to be rational, realistic. I mean, the committees, they want to know, how did you get that guesstimate for your plane ticket? And that's just fine to say, you know, oh, that's Expedia estimate. If you're telling me that you need to rent an Italian villa at 2,000 euros a week, as opposed to staying in this 2-star hotel, explain to me why that's really necessary. I mean, again, the committee is trying to spread money out. So they want to make sure that you've really thought about this. It's you know, you don't need to be super thrifty, but pay attention to the budget and make sure it's realistic. That factors in terms of timing as well. If you tell me that your funding is going to send you to the British Library and you're going to get everything done in a week, I'm going to be kind of surprised. My experience, and you know, people are bringing their experience into the review, is that whenever you get into an archive, whenever you get into a collection, you find all kinds of cool stuff. And so it takes much longer. There's things you realize you want to see that you maybe didn't know. So you want to tell me about finding lists. You want to tell me about the catalogs. You want to tell me there are 14 cartons of notes from Heidegger seminars that I'm going to spend a month going through, and I've got a digital camera that I'm doing it. We want to know that you're hitting the ground running, that you've thought through the logistics of this project. If you're collaborating with people, if you're going to hire a student and you know who it is, if Lynn's got a grad student and they're going to work with her and they've already got the particular skills she needs for this project, and you can tell us that, that's awesome. I mean, that just shows us how this is going to be a really successful grant. If you don't have someone in mind, I mean, that's okay too, but tell us about the specific work they're going to do. Will they be tagging metadata? Will they be transcribing interviews? Will they be preparing an index under your direction? So all of that sort of stuff to be explicit. That's really hard to do. When Drew and I were looking for a time to set this up, and this will be kind of be my closing point of my remarks, we thought this had to be early in the semester, even though we're still all really busy as we're launching the semester, because you're about 3 weeks away from the deadline. And it takes a while to really craft a solid application that explains what it is you're doing and why it matters. And that's what then you take out and you go use it to the external applications as well. So I feel like I've been talking a lot. So let me stop and see if people have questions or if you want me to say more about something in particular.
Leslie, thank you for doing this. It's so helpful.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me? Am I giving feedback, or can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious still about the difference between the summer faculty fellowship and the regular research grant. So if I wanted to get some kind of training, you were implying that that would be a regular research grant type of application versus I want to work on this project and I need time to do that. Is that right?
Right. So if you were doing something like that, I would strongly recommend applying for both. And the committee, they don't have to fund both of them. It might be you would only get the RRG, or maybe you would only get the summer faculty funding, but you're still going to then in practice get the time and money. But when you're crafting that application, so if you need to go to a workshop in Washington, DC, so there might be an admission fee for the workshop, there would be travel, there'd be your housing there, there'd be your food while you're there. There might be particular materials you need to buy for that. That could all be RRG money. It could in practice, because I mean, you are talking about like, well, this would be my time, and that is kind of what I would do from a summer faculty funding. Strategically though, I would apply for both. And then you would say that, you know, I'm going to be off in this workshop and I'm going to be applying the fruits of this workshop in this grant application, in this chapter, in this article, in this whatever.
So to apply for both, though, you really have to make the case for the distinctiveness of the work that would be done with both, or, I mean, you can't necessarily have the same flavor of application to both, can you?
You kind of, you kind of can. And that's why they fit so well together, because you don't apply for them separately. You just have the check boxes on the first page where you indicate you want to be considered for both. And it's kind of up there a little bit up to the committee to figure out, you know, like, does this make sense? And I would say in practice, don't worry about it. Anya, I think you had your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I agree. This is really helpful. So I'm wondering if it is necessary to be preparing to apply for a larger external grant in all cases for these. So I'll just, that's not the most eloquently worded question. So basically what I mean is, for those of us who are junior faculty, we're probably working on maybe our first book project or articles related to the dissertation. Perhaps a lot of the work is already done, but maybe we need extra time to collect more data for a new chapter or something that will be part of the book project, something like this. We're probably not going to apply to NSF funding for this project that is mostly over. But perhaps we have intentions to do that for a future project, our next book project, which will get started once we can wrap up the first one. So is it okay if we are looking to this grant to help finish up and sort of tie loose ends? Or is there always this expectation that, this grant will then lead to future externals?
That's a great question. And I know there are some people who are more social sciences, and then some of the STEM fields might be watching this as well. And I would say that the STEM fields, if you're going NIH or NSF, it's probably a little bit different. And especially if you're trying to get R01 or career awards at NSF. For humanities, though, or projects that skew that way more in the social sciences, yes, what you're just describing, I mean, a lot of people are revising dissertations. This is the thing that's going to get them into tenure, and the committee absolutely recognizes that. And there's that box on the thing where you would say, I do not need a major grant to help complete this work, although maybe, there's some of the ACLS or something like that. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, so here's one of my rants. It's very frustrating that so many of these big external grants that have low fund rates, that we know they have low fund rates, and they're requiring external letters of support, and it's not a fundable project at this point, or for this thing, and you really don't want to burn your bridges yet still. So that can be really sort of annoying. And so I would recommend saying, where I am right now is I'm completing work where I've already collected the data, the research, archival components are basically done. Part of my time, though, will be exploring the next element. So the Spencer Foundation and their education-related research, or the Digital Humanities Initiative at the NEH. You're sort of showing, I am aware of the field. And then the other thing is, in some ways we're conditioned to think, the really big pots of money, the NEHs, the ACLSs, but there's a lot of smaller ones. One of the most recent grants I had was from the American Philosophical Society, the Franklin Research Grant, and it's research for travel to collections. And so it got me to Italy, but it could get you to Chicago, or it could get you, I don't know, to the Twin Cities or something like that. And so there's really not like, we're looking, some departments in the university do have, we want so much grant dollars. We don't care. Or the Marquette doesn't care. And if you're like in a field like mine, like, wow, $1,000, look what I can do now. That's great. And so that just, you've thought about the range of fields or even foundations that you might want to fund too. But absolutely, the committee will distinguish where you are in your career. And then it might be, there are some people who I think apply, every time they're eligible. So you're eligible a year after you've had an award, roughly every 2 years. The committee will pay attention. We do they try to spread money around. I don't think anybody is kind of a serial grantor. People can go, 4, 6, 10 years, just when it's appropriate for them. They will want to see, okay, so Jennifer had the regular research grant and she published this book as a result after, and she also applied for this grant, or here's where I am. So it's also about sort of your trajectory of your work. Yeah. I think hopefully that got everything. So great. Yeah, and if there are things from the American Sociological Association, those are also great ones. So, Jennifer, you have a hand up.
I do. Yeah, thank you so much for this. It's very helpful. I have two related questions. So the first one is, I read that if you're applying, for one of the grants or both, and you're just coming off from something that was funded, then you should wait. But then I wondered if how that relates to sabbatical. So I'm on sabbatical, but it's not funded.
Mhm.
So that was one question. And then the second question is related, and that is, once you fulfill the criteria of applying for an external grant, then is there a certain number of years? Can you apply anytime after that?
Yeah, no, you can apply as soon as you're eligible. And so when you've had funding for summer faculty funded or regular research grant, within sort of the 2-year cycle after that, you're supposed to apply for external funding. And on behalf of ORSP, I'll nag all of us to make sure you register your grant in Quali. And as a department chair, make sure you do this because your departments get credit for this. A lot of Marquette faculty don't, and it's annoying, but do that. So that's how they know that you've applied for things, not just what you write on the application. But having said that, there are exceptions. I mean, funding agencies that just aren't giving grants, archives that are closed, you were not able to take up fellowships. If you're on an unfunded sabbatical, I mean, these are all the things that I think are useful to be said, because we also, we all assume again that like, well, of course she's on a funded sabbatical because I had a funded sabbatical. So just helping people understand what it is that you are doing. And I'd say the only bias in terms of putting things in multiple times, I mean, you should apply for all the funding that makes sense for your project that you have the time to do. But just that because resources are limited, folks will kind of consider like, oh, he had 2 regular research grants that were related to this project and it's been really successful, but what if we give funding to somebody else and give them an opportunity to get out? But it's hard to say what the current committee will do and how projects speak to them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for the raise hand function and I can't find it. So do you mind if I ask another question?
Please.
So you alluded to getting some feedback after the grants are reviewed.
Yes.
And then you talked about maybe ORSP or even Jean Hassenlop would be a good person to follow up with afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
How much feedback is given and how typical is it that people would just ask for more feedback or clarification on their applications?
Yeah, so realistically, it is somewhat limited in terms of time, but what the review committee will do is write up notes for each one, and then there is a sort of brief summary statement that is shared. We try to write them to be constructive. I will say I got feedback circa 2016. It was something like, well, her research probably won't matter for anyone who isn't in her field. But well, for heaven's sakes, doesn't that describe everyone's research to some extent? But trying to say, what we wanted to hear, we really like this project, but wanted to hear more about that. One of the things I see, I saw on these applications, and this is a little bit more to junior faculty, but I think more senior faculty, as you're launching new projects, it can be a factor as well. Sometimes it's just way too big what they represent. I'm revising the dissertation. Well, probably not over the summer, unless you're working 40 hours a day, 9 days a week. It's a part of the project that you're trying to move forward. And so we'll say something about that. Sometimes we will make specific recommendations for grants. I think it can be a little bit different. I mean, looking at the names who are up here, there are probably some of you who are more likely to go into the social sciences pool. That's when I think, you've got to be really sort of clear about the nature of the research, because it's going to be kind of a mix of qualitative and quantitative folks. Whereas I don't think there's anybody here who's out of the bench sciences. I mean, those are NSF type panels, and I think they're a little more bruising than we are in the humanities for that. So that would be the kind of feedback. And I would say that Erin often has been the one helping, for Erin from ORSP Fulstad, with the humanities ones. And I mean, she would be somebody who would be good to sit down and say, here are some grants that other people at Marquette have applied for. Have you considered those? And they're often ones you probably already knew about. Perhaps some of the foundations might be something that's different. I know Jean sometimes gets calls from outraged senior people who want to know, well, why wasn't my brilliant project funded? And it's really often just an issue of resources, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I didn't talk about the collaborative ones. I've only seen a couple of those come in through humanities, but those can be something I think that are really neat too. And, seeing some of your names on the screen, one of the things I've loved the most when I was about my years on the Committee on Research is I got to find out the sorts of projects colleagues are working on that I wouldn't necessarily know. And seeing potential collaborations outside the obvious partnerships. I mean, I have colleagues here in history who I've come out of review sessions saying, hey, do you know X in this college? There's somebody who you might want to talk with about those things. And I don't know this for a fact, but if we think about the discussions that have gone on around Marquette this past year about like the research affinities and the ideas that came out of the research working group, which the core members were part of, and how do we identify some of these areas of concentration? So I'm thinking about some of the public health stuff that is drawing in people from social sciences and humanities, in addition, to the obvious collaborators in health sciences or nursing and other fields like that. And so it may be that some of you do want to reach out for somebody, and that could be a really interesting summer of faculty funding. You might not normally do collaborative research, but this would be a great use of your time. For Emily and Emily's on my screen right now, we'll figure out something that intersects between our project or learning something entirely new.
Can I ask a question, Leslie?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if you might have already covered this and I missed it, but I'm just not sure. So I want to articulate it again just to make sure, because we actually had this come up in a round of HWW grants over the course of the last semester. So my question is, and I'm not sure if I can articulate this well, but the question basically is, can you apply for a regular research grant or summer faculty funding to help facilitate research for another grant that you've already received? Because you mentioned course buyouts, I think, is one possibility, one thing you can get from I think if I heard you right, the regular research grant. And
yes.
So if you're saying basically, I need this course buyout, but I know, for example, that some like Mellon grants, for instance, have it worked into where you can't request a course buyout. Mm-hmm. Can you request it for research you're doing that's for another grant that you've already received, if that makes sense?
You can. Okay. I suspect that the discussion might be, oh, but Drew's already got, $12K to do X. And so, maybe we should be giving it to somebody who doesn't have access to any money because he's kind of doing this work. But I think if you made a case for it, it absolutely would be considered. There was somebody who applied for a project in humanities, and it made sense in the humanities, but they had NSF funding for a kind of sister sort of project. And they made a case for what the work was and how it, couldn't be part of the NSF project. So that was certainly viable.
Thank you.
Mhm. You have to start calling on people, Drew. Like in discussions.
Cold calling.
I'm seeing names up here, people I recognize who have had really cool applications.
Well, does anybody else have anything for Leslie? Any further questions? As I mentioned at the beginning, this is being recorded, so we'll get it up on the website as quickly as possible. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, then, oh, yeah, just thank you. Yes, a virtual round of applause. I'm trying to find I thought, yeah, there's a reaction where we can clap on here, right? I think I'm doing it, yeah. So round of applause for Leslie, and thank you so much for your time. This has been extremely helpful.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for giving up your time too. This is a busy time of semester. It's always a busy time of semester, but this fall seems warp speed.
Absolutely. So.
And of course, Drew, right? You're keeping track of everybody's names so you can invite them to join committees.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
For the advancement of the humanities.
Oh yeah, that email will be being circulated very shortly.
It was a trick. And if you get a chance to serve on a grant committee, I mean, this is really how you learn how to write and review them and figuring out how to really present your work to people outside your field. I know the American Historical Association is really advocating for us to volunteer to be NEH reviewers. And I'm sure all the associations have versions of these things. And it's often the way to really figure out exactly how to present your stuff and have a better shot at getting funding. Of course, it's always hard. There's going to be more people applying. Probably most people here did not know my now emeritus colleague, Julius Ruff. He's a wonderful person, but he also had a few standard rants that he liked to pull out. And one of them was about the zip codes as related to NEH and ACLS funding and how, they don't give grants to Catholic universities except for, Notre Dame and Boston College, and they all go to, they've got a 0 at the beginning or a 9. And, he wasn't wrong, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aiming for some funding. So.
Well, and I think, Leslie, this kind of training is so important because, there's grant writing standards, right? But then there's decoding kind of how this grant writing process works. And I learned so much that I never would have gathered from the website or just the basic instructions. So it really is helpful to do this kind of mentoring. And I certainly thank you for your time.
Oh, good. I'm really glad it was useful. I didn't look to see if they had updated which ones models that are up there, but we've recently had a few, and I'll touch base with Mel, who I thought had some really good ones. Tara Daly had a really awesome application, and I know she applied for NEH summer funding kind of in conjunction with her application here, and Jerry Canavan had a really good one from Humanities as well. So we'll make sure to get some good examples, and then you read them and you figure out what works for your project.
Yeah, having models is always so helpful, and just hearing the range of what people are doing and how they kind of narrate their projects is so important. Even if it's not in your field, it gives you a template or an idea.
Yeah, that's it exactly.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you everybody for coming.
Bye.
Now folks have to run off to 1 o'clock.
Bye. Thanks
everybody.
Bye.